Nanette Paxton, who is our British journalist in residence, and she'll be facilitating this afternoon. So, Nanette.
Thank you. Thank you, Faith. But of course, it's not me that's the star of the show. It's our wonderful panel. Thank you for coming back, some of our panel members, and for some new ones. So we want you to be listening, students, for story ideas, taking notes, making sure that, I always call them little stars from heaven. When they come, you've got to catch them or they just disappear. And you'll hear plenty of them from these amazing speakers to give you some story ideas. So let me introduce everyone first. Firstly, we have Kevin Cox, thank you, who spoke before, Queensland's Discrimination Commissioner. Also, we have Brett Casey, again, Chief Executive Officer of Deaf Services Queensland. And Jeff Cooper, who's a community animator, a peer leader and mentor for Queenslanders with Disability Network. We've got Donna Best down the end, who is a self-advocate. John Catania, journalist and advocate. And Jen Kiriakou, close, sorry. She's a parent and an advocate for the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics Australia. So please welcome our panel. Oh, and Jill Goodman, who gave one of the most beautiful speeches in the last break. Sorry, Jill, and welcome, Jill. Thank you. And I have to say how wonderful it is that self-advocates have been part of this process today. It was really important to have your contribution as well as the organisations that represent you. So thank you for coming. So this panel is about We Don't All Speak with One Voice. And I think actually on that note, it would be good to speak to our self-advocates first about what their views are on this. Is this something that frustrates you perhaps with some media coverage that there's labels put on people with a disability? What's your perspective on that, Jill, that we don't all speak with one voice? Have you found that sometimes in media coverage it's been a little bit limited, or?
Yeah, journalists seem to put disabilities in a negative frame, and I think that it's really important that the journalists see people as a whole person, not just a disability.
So that's something you'd like to see in the coverage from the students, that it includes the whole person. Yeah. And
we have a microphone, please? We can hardly hear you.
Can we boost the microphones a little bit? Thank you, team. Donna, we might need to put the little mic over a little bit towards you as well. They're the desk mics at this stage. What's your view on that, that we don't all speak with one voice? Is that something you've found when you've had anything to do with media in the past or in coverage that you've seen?
I just think that the media make out people with intellectual disabilities, oh, they're poor people. We're not poor people. We've got the same rights as everybody else in Australia.
So it would be good to get that across in stories, the breadth of people and their experiences.
I also have in the back of my mind a young lady who was a Paralympian, and she went over to the 1992 Games in Barcelona, where they had the Spanish team as the basketballers, and they were all normal people instead of people with disabilities. So people with intellectual disabilities had to be retested so they could go into the Olympics.
And that really hasn't had the amount of coverage it deserves, has it? And the ramifications of that. I mean, how did that feel really for the broader community?
And can I just say something? I think that the ABC do a lot of good stories about people with disabilities. I just think that most of my members from my group listen to the ABC because the ABC do give the people with disabilities a fair go.
And how does that come across? What's a fair go, do you think?
they'll listen to the person and not make them out to be, oh, that poor person.
So listening's really important.
Yeah.
I was speaking with our good friend Denver before, he's part of one of our training videos, and he said that too, that sometimes when he's done interviews, he feels that he hasn't been listened to, that the notes weren't very accurate, that there were just really simple mistakes, and I think that's something we can learn from as journalists.
And I also think that the journalists shouldn't have their own agenda. If they just listen to the person with the disability, yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that. Yes, very true. Thank you, Rob. John, is that something you've got the perspective from both sides of the fence? You were telling me before, as a journalist yourself at times, and also having been interviewed.
That's
What-
correct.
Yeah.
From my perspective, I think that it's very, very important for journalists to recognise that it's what Alistair was saying before. To me, I see disability framed in the media as various stereotypes or various boxes, categories in which people are put. As Alistair said, the victim mode is one, the aspirational mode is another, and it's fantastic that there are people in society that achieve to very high levels, but we're looking at these people with disabilities have achieved as athletes, just as athletes as any other athlete is. So we want to look beyond the fact that they're an athlete with a disability and see what actually motivates them as human beings to strive and achieve that level of excellence which other athletes achieve. So what's the deeper issue? What are the deeper issues in terms of their drive, their goals, their aspirations that motivate them? And people with disabilities are not one or the other. They're not victims, nor are they inspirational figures. There are people with disabilities that I engage with every day at sporting wheelies in the gym, and we all come from different, pardon the pun, walks of life. And I think as journalists, I think as journalists it's important to engage with the issues, well, with the circumstances of a person's humanity more than simply their disability.
So, John, have you found sometimes with interviews that there's been assumptions made that you feel perhaps the journalist has come with, or?
I think especially in today's day and age with the internet and digital media, social media, I've heard the phrase content is king a lot, and it bothers me. It's not quality is king, it's not depth is king, it's not investigation is king. Consequently, I'm probably a little more old school in the sense of I'm an advocate for longer form, more investigative kind of journalism. But I kind of think the days of Woodward and Bernstein are probably well past us, unfortunately. But
There's some hope.
there is some hope, I hope. But I think I have to feel some sympathy for journalists. When that kind of pressure is exerted upon you, it's almost inevitable, and it's certainly very easy to fall into the predefined stereotypes, the victim, the aspirational, focusing solely on challenges overcome as opposed to the issues of this person's life.
And how can journalists avoid that? What would be your advice? What do you think?
I definitely think listening is part of it. I also would like to say that what Kevin was saying before about framing things in a negative connotation, I definitely agree with that. I would also say, though, because we're all human beings and we're asking for the same level of equality as anyone else, we can't be insulated. So if there is an issue that, you know, might be something that's not good, that still needs to be addressed in the media, obviously. It can't be insulated or forgotten about or obfuscated. I'm not talking about that. But I am saying that your sensibilities as journalists is to look deeper, and it's important, especially when there are unintended consequences of portraying stereotypes or portraying and perpetuating stereotypes and negativity. There are unintended consequences, that it's important to look deeper at a negative issue and actually see, as investigative journalists, whether there are mitigating circumstances or whether there are issues around that need to be explored to give a much more rounded view of that issue and that person's role within that issue.
Jen, with your perspective as a parent as well as an advocate, can you tell us what you found perhaps some of the frustrations have been with media coverage and how that could be better handled?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a sense of, so there's how we treat and we talk about people with disability in the media, but I think we also need to be careful about how we talk about their supports, because quite often we hero worship the supports around people with a disability, and I don't like to see that. So an example of that type of story might be, you see it on Facebook quite a lot. I'm going to share this story because Joe took Sue to the prom and Sue's got Down syndrome. Oh wow, isn't he a hero? No, he's not a hero. He's just an average, everyday guy. So I think we need to be really careful about the way that we talk about the support networks that people with a disability have, children with a disability have. When we constantly talk about parents of children with disabilities as being heroes and going the extra mile, they're doing the best that they can, but hero worshipping those support networks around, what I feel as a parent, when we do that, we increase this imbalance of power between people with a disability and people that don't have a disability. And I don't want to see that imbalance of power where we're holding people up as being amazing just for being pretty average, really, just for being kind to someone with a disability or being their mate. And I just don't think, I think those stories absolutely frustrate me as a parent. Yeah.
So what are the stories that you'd like to see celebrated more, do you think?
Oh, I'd just like to take away the hero worshipping of anyone who's kind to someone with a disability. So, you know, if a local men's shed has brought in some people with disabilities, do we have to talk the story about how wonderful the local men's shed is? Perhaps we could turn that on its head and say how wonderful the people with disabilities are to come in and bring a different perspective to the work that they're doing in the men's shed. For me, I just find that, you know, there's a whole lot of things that stem from an imbalance of power, horrible things that stem when we have an imbalance of power between people. And if we continue to perpetuate this myth that we're doing people with a disability a favour by letting them in, then we increase this exclusion, we increase this terrible imbalance of power. So as a parent, that's what I would like to see, the end of sainting people.
Jeff, you've got a very interesting perspective as well. Your career development was interrupted due to losing a significant amount of your sight, and you've had some interesting experiences when that's been reported as well. Could you perhaps tell us, you're very passionate about getting people with a disability better engaged with the digital world too. So is there a perspective there on this that we don't all speak with one voice?
You've probably got the old bio there. I suppose digital technology has just become interesting to me because it's one of the ways that helps all of us. You know, so I'm passionate about our community being more creative and more real. So before I go to what you were mentioning, So I think that people with disability can speak with one voice. That's when they organise themselves and when they apply strategies and when they come to agreements and they speak in an organised way about what they've agreed to, just like every other person in the world. So that means also that we can, as humans, speak with one voice if we choose to. If we're disjointed and not conversing, then we're not going to speak with one voice. So, a lot of people with disability may say the same things because we do sometimes experience disadvantage and we may express similar experiences. But we're the same as everyone, that if we want to speak with one voice, then we have to organise ourselves to do so. I think that the big problem is that, thank God, we're actually becoming, the good thing is we're actually becoming more familiar with each other, slowly. So for myself, I'm a fairly ordinary looking guy. Some people tell me that since I grew the grey beard, I'm not so ordinary looking, but I stand at a bus stop with a white cane, and bus drivers don't know what that means, and complain that I don't hail them. I actually called the complaints line once and said, I'm trying to do everything I can to stop a bus. What else can I do? And she said, well, hang on. So what do you do when you're waiting for your bus and the bus comes? Do you wave your cane at the bus? And I just paused, and she went, "Oh, sorry." So we're not familiar with being with each other. And people with disability are just people who happen to have disabilities. I think it's important that we do have some understanding of some disadvantage, but I think disadvantage calls for strategy rather than sympathy. It's just the reality of life is that we have to get on. Real life is that we're all very different. And we're not experiencing real life unless we acknowledge the difference and celebrate that.
So some of those issues aren't getting out into the media. I suppose the practicalities, really, in some ways.
Yeah, I think similar to this, the difference with sympathy is I was in an article once where I told the person that I had 10% sight, and she reported me as being 10% blind, which sounded like the opposite to me. And I'm thinking, oh, poor me, I've lost 10% sight. So accuracy, listening. So I suppose that rather than just this sort of quick line to bring some sympathy, as we've been saying, engage with the person, what's happening here. I think people with disability can be inspirational, but so can people without disability. So get to know them and find out what's inspirational about them. And I think you might find it. I think the fact is, I know lots of people, I think I'm actually inspirational in some ways. I'm just starting to learn how to say that. But that's because I've been sort of a bit feeling like I'm lost and I can't go anywhere, and I've found my way through. I know lots of other people who, despite their disability, have achieved a lot, and they're inspirational because they have achieved a lot. But as the woman who did the inspiration porn
Yes.
TED Talk said,
Stella, yep.
yeah, when someone came to her mum and said, I'd like to nominate for your daughter for this award, and the mother said, but why? She hasn't done anything. And I think that was lovely that the mum was so attuned to the fact that I'm treating her as my daughter. Just because she has a disability doesn't make her special just for that. But if she does apply herself and become inspirational, she was inspirational in the end because she applied herself. Yeah.
So students, listen to that and make sure that you take good notes. As Denver said before when I was talking to him about that as well, he said, I wish they'd just tape recorded what I'd said. It's probably a good point. So make sure that you're getting everything accurately. Brett, your perspective on this, particularly from a deaf person's perspective, is when we say we don't speak with one voice, we speak with a female voice sometimes too, don't we? But what is your perspective on that?
I do. I actually agree with the majority of the panellists here. People with a disability come from different walks of life. They have needs just like you do. We have families, we have careers, we go travelling. We do just as much as everyone else does. We just happen to do it differently. How we get there is a little bit differently. So I think, yes, sometimes the media reports people with a disability as a collective, as one category. And as my learned friend next to me was saying, people come together and advocate for one voice. But at the same time, I think it's common issues. And the issues in the agenda that we're looking at is what brings people with a disability together and creates that force for advocacy. But that doesn't mean we're all the same. And I think Kevin, just before lunch, was talking about investigative journalism. And for example, Uber. The Uber example he gave, and possibly you may not understand, but Uber's great. It's a new way of getting a taxi. But with taxis, they're licensed, and a particular percentage of taxis need to be accessible for people with a disability, especially for physical disabilities. Uber, there's not the same requirements. So if an Uber takes off and the company grows, potentially there could be less taxis available, and public transport for people with a disability is a major issue as well. For me as a deaf person, it is great, Uber, because it's done through an app. It comes, I don't have to talk to the driver. I don't have to try and work out how I can communicate with the driver. They know where I'm going. Everything is done automatically for me, and it's brilliant and it's lovely. So we all have different needs. So one person with a disability thinks one thing and I think the opposite, because we're at opposite ends of the spectrum on that particular issue. So investigation in your journalism is really important. And we are all different, and I have a very different perspective to what Kevin has. And we call that, or in the deaf community, we call it deafhood. That my views would be very different to your views because we've got a different lived experience. So if I'm interviewed for a job, my contribution to the organisation and why they should give me the job will be different to everyone else. In the interview, I can provide them with a different perspective, and investigation is really integral.
From a journalist perspective, I think perhaps there is some fear from journalists that they don't want to offend, particularly if they haven't met a deaf person before, or certainly have not interviewed a deaf person. How would you advise them on the practicalities of doing an interview? How do you refer, for example, to an interpreter in the story? What would you advise?
Sometimes the interpreter gets more attention than me. Oh, how did you learn how to sign? It's like, hello, I'm over here. But the reality for all of you to understand is that people can be quite panicked about terminology and what terminology they utilise. So 10% was the example that was given, can only see 10%, and then the report was saying he's 10% blind. It's the complete opposite. It's the same with deafness. I'm deaf, I'm not hard of hearing, I'm not hearing impaired, I'm deaf. And I have nothing wrong, I see nothing wrong with using the word as deaf. That's a community identity for me, that's who I am. So terminology point of view, that would be quite offensive for me if you said hard of hearing person Brett in your investigations because you didn't investigate appropriately and see what I identify as. And I think people do get quite panicked by terms and what to say. And quite often people go to me, oh, tell him this and tell him that. Talk to me, talk directly to me, look to me. And we all have different ways of how we will give you tips on the best way to interview us and how you could interview me as a person who happens to be deaf or a person who happens to be in a wheelchair or may have a different type of disability.
Thank you for that perspective. So Kevin, as Queensland's Discrimination Commissioner, I'm sure you have heard much of this before, but what can you add to it? Is that full gamut of points of view, isn't it? We don't all speak with one voice. What's your perspective?
Well, that's right. We don't speak with one voice because we are diverse. Each and every one of us is diverse. I could stereotype journalists as saying heavy drinkers, heavy smokers, and never leave the pub and are always insiders. Now, that's partially true, isn't it? Well, put up your hands. Yes. But when you look at your as you as an individual, I might see a female, but is that your gender identity? Are you Christian, Muslim, Jewish, agnostic, atheist, Hindu? What is your preferred, what is your sexuality? What is your relationship status? What are your values? What are your other interests? When you start to think about you as an individual, and break that down, you're very, very diverse. And that is what makes us as individuals. And even though you might all be journalists, you'll have a variety of voices on the way that things should be done. You could interview Brett and I and have 43 different stories. I'm not sure if there are 43 journalist students here, but, you know. But, and what I did forget to say when I was damning Uber was what they did do in their innovation was, I wasn't saying the taxi industry didn't need some disruption, because they've been a monopoly for 130 or 40 years in the world. But what they did do was disrupt the way you engage. Now, Uber is a taxi provider. It cannot just act as Pontius Pilate and wash its hands of the service delivery. They are a call centre. And the way that we understand in the distribution, if you call a centre, you get a service, and that is a vehicle. So, and they've got a problem because now they're have a class action in America under the ADA because of failing to deliver services, and which comes under our transport standards. So not only are you obliged to deliver a service in the same time as I ring up as somebody without a disability, you're obliged to provide an accessible service at the same cost. And what they've shown in America, where they've researched, they are taking a lot longer to deliver a service and it costs a lot more because it's the old economic argument, supply and demand. So let's forget about Uber. But it'd be bloody boring if we all spoke with one voice. What makes the world evolve is diversity, is the diversity of opinions and diversity of ideas. And that's why people with disabilities have been treated as homogenous. Every one of us on this table has a very different story through our lived experience and the way that we experience impairment, the way that we experience life, and the way that we experience everything else that goes along with life. I have two stories. One, living life without a disability for 21 years, and one living life with disability for 36 years. Within months after my accident, I was told I'd be better off living with my kind of people. And when I asked who my kind of people were, they said other people with spinal injuries. And I said, Rackhoff nor me, my kind of people are the buffheads I play football with, go to the races with, drive fast and slow cars with, back fast and slow horses, and try to pick up nice girls. They're my kind of people. Not, and there might have been other blokes in wheelchairs who, wanted to drive fast and slow cars and back slow and fast racehorses. But it's about our commonalities that will bring us together, not some false stereotype. I think I've raved on enough.
Thank you. No.
With New Tender Ready to Go project, we've just been given people with intellectual disabilities the understanding of the NDIS. I have got some wonderful stories, and some of the people in this room know some of the stories. I'd like to share a few of the stories with you. We had a young man in Cairns. His mother, he had an intellectual disability, he had a physical disability, and his mother said that he wouldn't understand what you were talking about. When we came up to choose and control, he chose to take his shoes off, so he knew what we were talking about.
So the importance of speaking to people with an intellectual disability and not just their carers or their parents.
And also, there's another story, which is we had a young lady, we did a workshop in Maryborough. She used a communications thing. So if we typed the questions into her communications board, she was engaged with us. But before we typed the questions into her, she wasn't encouraged. And I can also say another story that I love, and Alex was involved with a story with me, was a young man who had Down syndromes that wasn't engaging with everybody, but as soon as we mentioned the doctors, Doctor Who, all the Doctor Who's, and I had to think of all the doctors.
So finding the way to communicate that is that your interviewee is perhaps most appropriate and comfortable with.
So with the Ready to Go project, we have had a lot of difficult communications. We've had to do workshops with 2 interpreters. For most of the people that I've worked with, I've never had to do that before. So that was an experience.
Wonderful. Look, thank you very much, Donna, and thank you for adding that. These are really important perspectives. I'm hoping we've got time, with time pressures that we have, for a couple of questions. So I'd love it if the students could perhaps go from their notes and give a couple of questions to our respected panel here. Thank you. And if you could say your name, that'd be great. Thank you.
Hi guys, I'm Hayden McKee, student journalist for Project Open Doors. Now, I just wanted to ask a question. You keep on talking about communicating with one voice, but also individually. I just wanted to know, has speaking with one voice given you guys the opportunity to speak to the government to affect changes in policies, but has that also been detrimental to other members of the community? So let's say there's more of a focus on deaf and blind services as opposed to general with the Angelman syndrome. I've never heard of that before. Has that been your case?
There's no funding for Angelman syndrome whatsoever, so in order for that to happen, parents need to come together to create a foundation on top of looking after their children. In terms of speaking with one voice, there's been times when it's been very advantageous for the Angelman syndrome community to come together and speak to politicians. When the Better Start funding initiative first started, it was based on, I think, about 5 disabilities, which did not include Angelman, so our children didn't receive the funded therapies that, say, the kids with autism did. So in order for that to happen, we need to go to the media and we need to use the media to get that message across, as well as connecting with politicians. So we do actually sometimes need to speak with one voice. And sometimes we know that the story that we're trying to get across is not the story that's going to be written, but we go with it anyway. So if for example, with Angelman syndrome, which we're trying to increase diagnosis rates, we know that article will be written with Jill suffers from Angelman syndrome. The smile hides the pain of her seizures. And we know that's what it's going to look like. But we just have to, it's a means to an end. So we just do what we have to do. So in our case, speaking with one voice. But if you look at the community as a whole, we all have very different ideas on what inclusion are. Their kids are all different ages, so they're at a different stage. So I can't even say that there's a homogenous voice for Angelman syndrome. There's just really not. So each individual disability or each individual age group will all have their own voice. And some parents are very much geared towards inclusion and others are not interested at all. So even within that, you will find different voices from different families and different individuals.
I think there was another question just at the back there.
Hi, I'm Sam Burnett. Pauline Hanson recently argued against letting people with autism in schools. She'd never go after someone with a physical disability. How come people, disabled people that aren't physically disabled, what makes them an easier target?
I think you might, she said, people with autism and other disabilities, and I could be cynical and say why she didn't say physical disability is because you can't get into most schools anyway, because they're inaccessible. But she was talking generally, and the danger of whether it's about autism or plucking out any disability is you're starting to send a message that reinforces the other, and that people with disabilities should not be included in society in any general way. And we should just put aside the crumbs of the pie for them to fight over. And I was going to go back to the earlier gentleman's question. One of the things most of you journalists won't remember Joe, Sir Joe Bjelke-Petersen. One of the great favours he did for Queenslanders with disability was he never funded anything. And so when we did get some funding in 1987, Queensland Advocacy was the first advocacy voice funded in Queensland. And it represented all people. Its first mission statement was to empower all people with disabilities. So people with different types of disability got together because of that commonality of being excluded and shut out of society. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but I think that's what you've got to look at. When somebody says something, it has often overflowing consequences for all. So that's where we will speak with one voice, and we need to stand up and take her and call her for what she is. And she is a bigot who wants to exclude anybody that is not a redhead and thinks like her.
Well, I am very conscious of our time and that we do have other panels. Faith, you'd like one more question? Mm-hmm.
Hi, my name's Tally. I'm a student journalist from the Gold Coast. My question, I suppose, is predominantly for you, John. Nancy might be able to add as well. We talked a lot today about what kind of stories we'd like to see. Maybe in the future we'll all be senior journalists and have control of the newsrooms. But in the meantime, do you have any advice on how to get these stories over the line with Chief of Staffs and how to make these stories seem more attractive?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. How to make them seem more attractive. I think the breadth of humanity is inherently attractive. I don't think you necessarily have to try to pitch in a way that is going to be more sentimental or more emotionally charged than just telling an authentic story. I think that is the thing that's most attractive, is telling an authentic story in an authentic way. So that's as simple as I could really put it, really.
I agree. Yes, it's a powerful human story, pitching it that way. And I think for me it was really vital to get editors and chiefs of staff on board early and to explain to them what I saw the story as and to take their feedback, and if theirs was a bit skewed, as sometimes it can be, to try and creatively bring them back to what you're trying to make. It's a constant process. Some journos see the process as the chief of staff giving them a piece of paper and then they go off, and it's not like that, the way that I do journalism. I think it is a to and fro, and you're trying to improve the coverage all the time. So that would be my advice, I think.
Can I add one thing? I've worked with journalists for over nearly 40 years in my advocacy role, and one is to get to the top. And mate, if you're trying to have trouble getting your chief of staff or your editor, get them to meet the person and get them to build a relationship with the person. Because once you build relationships, then you can transform the world.
Thank you. Oh, do we? Oh, great.
I'd like
Did you
to
want?
say
Yes, Jill. What
something.
would you like to add to that?
Well, this is about my disability, having an intellectual disability and also mental health stuff. But the disabilities, they range from mild to severe. So everyone is different in their disability. And I think that's important to know.
And to in a story, how different people are. Yeah. Okay.
This one. Journalism student. This is a question for John. I just wanted to know what role, if any, does gambling play in disabled sports, and how does that affect media coverage?
Gambling. I imagine Jeff would probably have a really good perspective on this later on. Well, yeah, I'm not a Paralympian, and that's the other thing is that commonly I'll get not just in interviews but in walks of life, people come up and ask me, do I play sport? And I think, well, no. Do you? That's my question back to them is no. Do you? So there's an assumption that's made, but that's by the by. As far as gambling is concerned, I can imagine that when you're at that elite level trying to strive and you're that kind of competitive personality and that kind of competitive mindset, that it applies equally to people with disabilities and everybody else in terms of gambling, performance enhancing substances, trying to fix the system, kind of game the system. I think that's an inherently human condition, and it applies equally to people who are trying to gain an edge in whatever field.
How aware people are of different kinds of sport. If there's no gambling happening in the Paralympics, then maybe it's not as broadly aware as it should be, because people are going to gamble on stuff that people know about. Sorry, do you mind if I do have a crack at that?
For sure, yes.
You'd be good at this.
Do we have a handheld mic that we can bring over, perhaps?
Maybe you might want to introduce Jeff.
So, Jeff, thank you. He's the founder of Inclusion Moves. And Jeff, could you just
Sure.
give us a bit of background and your perspective on this?
Just as an answer to that question, I am a former Paralympic athlete, and I can certainly say that and first of all, let me say that I'm completely anti-sports gambling. But if gambling was ever to be taken seriously in a Paralympic sport context, I would actually be the happiest man alive, because it would mean that true inclusion had actually taken place in Paralympic sport. So I would be quite over the moon, and I know a number of I've got the opportunity to speak a little bit more freely, given I've retired, but I know a few of the guys that are still competing would completely agree with me. And the same thing with drugs in sport. It's amazing how many journos ask me or tell me. So I assume there's no drugs in sport in Paralympic sport. And again, because I've retired, I can tell you that's completely false. But don't expect me to go any further with that answer. But just to reiterate my point, the true inclusion is actually when a sport has been taken seriously, no matter whether there's a disability context there or not. So I would be the happiest man alive if there was people betting on the IPC World Championships in athletics that start over in London in a couple of days' time.
Well, thank you. Faith, I know we're still waiting on our caterers. Uh-huh. Okay. Oh, sure. Yes, Jeff.
Children with autism. And in fact, it wasn't about not wanting to bring them in, it was about wanting to kick them out, really, because actually there are people with autism who are successfully engaging in school and adding to those school environments. And I think the thing is that we've got a history of separation and exclusion around unfamiliarity. So we've always separated people, and I think that the way people get around in their mobility has been sort of a bit more of an easier thing to, like, we've started to get used to the fact that we get around in different ways, and so it's not as easy to separate now. So even though there's poor access for physical ability sometimes. There's not as many people. I remember a person who was a Paralympian who was patted on the head as they came out of the plane in a really condescending way, simply because they were in a wheelchair. But still now, I think because we've dealt with the physical stuff a bit, but behavioural stuff is a step up again. So if someone's behaving differently, then they're going to again be separated and excluded. But we have to learn that we all behave differently. And sometimes those behaviours are good and bad, and even people with autism have amazing strengths, like someone said before. But there's easy target, I suppose, and lack of experience, lack of, something said and it's assumed to be true. In fact, children who don't experience, say, autism, are probably going to learn a lot about humanity if they engage with people with autism, for example.
Was there one last question, Faith, or are we having it? Yep.
Hi, I'm Billy. I'm a journalism student. My question is aimed at Donna. When you said you're working with the Ready to Go project to help the people living with disability to understand the NDIS, one of the things that I read up on when I was reading it earlier was that you get to select the supports that you want to engage in with the program. So would the Ready to Go project have any practices in place to help people selectively make those choices? Because one of the challenges they were facing was how much control are they giving the people? So how are you enabling these people to have that same level of control in choosing their support?
Everybody, under my understanding of the NDIS, is that when you go to your planner, you sit down and you say exactly what you want in your plan, and you specifically say what you want in your plan. So that's choice and control. Everybody can have a choice of what they do in their life.
So, sorry, I feel like I might have worded that a little bit wrong. What I was trying to say is that when it was mentioned earlier that some people have more trouble communicating what they want, and they are often inhibited by other people saying that they might not be able to make that choice for themselves. Does the program have practices in place that are overstepping that boundary to making sure that they are getting their choices put across? And what sort of communication techniques would be used there?
In our workshops that we have done, everybody has had a fair say in what they want in their plans, and some of them take along the carers or their support person or their families to our particular workshops, and they sit down and say what they want. For argument's sake, we had a young man that I did a workshop with that he was in grade 11 at school, and he had a wishing tree of what you want to do in your life. And he was very upset that his mother wrote on his wishing tree, and he turned around and said in front of the group, "Mum, I don't want you to do that again. It's my decision what I want in my life." Yeah. So everybody has, under the NDIS, my understanding is has a choice.
So with regards to minors, would they be given the same?
I don't know about minors because we only deal from 18 to 64 and 64 and 11 months. When Paige comes on to the next thing, she might be able to answer that question for you.
Jen, did you have a perspective for younger people? Thank you, Donna. But Jen, did you have a perspective for minors?
Yeah, I mean, effectively, parents will step in and make those decisions on behalf of the children. But I'm really, really big on creating community and communication pathways for children with disability, making sure that they're included and that they have the same opportunities. So for parents, it's about working out what it is that their children want to do. My child is non-verbal, so it can be quite tricky. She has very complex communication needs, but it's my job as her mum to work out what she wants to do, and with that be with an alternative communication device. That's what we will go through that process when the time comes for her to make those choices. But a lot of parents that I know will be going through the process. But it's great if you can have a greater community around so that someone can tap me on the shoulder and say, actually, I don't think that's what she wants to do. I think she wants to do something else. So creating that community around you keeps parents in check a little bit, so parents can step out, other people can step in and start to have her community have a say in communicating and supporting and empowering her as a child up to an adult in what she wants to do with her life.
Okay, we definitely have one final question from Robert, who is one of our fantastic collaborators and had his photo on the website.
Yeah, I'm a medalist from CUNY in Brisbane. All right, I've heard the word disability 168 times today. Which is that we've got a disability, but we can't always focus on the person with the disability because we are human as well. All right? Well, I can tell you, for instance, back in the 70s, if you had a disability, you were put in either an institution or you were put into a special school, which I could say, 98% of those kids what went to my school just had a learning disability. No in a wheelchair, walking stick, one leg or anything like that. But we're all classed as a disability because we couldn't read or write. Right? But if we can educate not just the people with the society now, like the police, right? They need a huge lesson in dealing with people with disabilities. The same with the hospitals. We haven't got a choice. And this is where the NDIS will come in and say, I don't want to get bathed at 5 o'clock in the morning, I want to get it at 8 o'clock. And that's our choice is what we can have when we've got with NDIS.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you to our panel. Thank you, everyone. One more question.
Oh, I'm so sorry. My name's Maddie. I'm a journalism student and an aspiring sports journalist. I've been given the chance to work with the Commonwealth Games and had the opportunity to chat to Kurt Fearnley. And recently, as you may have noticed, he has been announced as a GC 2018 ambassador. And he's been quoted saying, "This is a recognition of the importance of parasports." So this is, to me, this comes across as this is his identity. He is a Paralympian, and he has said to me that his disability is why he is here today. So you guys mentioned heroism and feeding into that stereotype. However, in my opinion, that's how he views himself. He's not feeding into any stereotype. So,
how do you report that?
Exactly.
Yep.
What he has done is quite exceptional, able-bodied or not. It's what he has done is quite heroic. What we're talking about here in terms of heroism, or at least what I'm talking about, is when you do something very average, like take someone to a dance who may have a disability, and then you're hero worshipped as a for being kind to someone with a disability or stepping outside of your comfort zone to be with someone with a disability. So probably from my perspective around heroism, that's where I sit when you're just doing something that is just very average and you are hero worshipped for that. But there is Kurt Fearnley, who I take my hat off to because he's a Paralympian.
Also, the Commonwealth Games, some people with mild intellectual disabilities have been elected to go to be volunteers at the Commonwealth Games at the Gold Coast.
Excellent.
Yep.
And Kevin?
I think I agree with what you said about Kurt, and if you know Kurt's story, if you watch Ann Doe's Brush with Fame, Kurt's story is about it takes a village to raise a child, because he grew up in a small town of 200, and because his great-grandparents went to that school, his parents and his brothers and sisters, the headmaster showed leadership and said, Kurt's coming and not going anywhere else. And so Kurt, from that time, was raised by a village, and which meant, and that's the thing that I think that I used that quote before about George Day. It's not welcoming somebody into what already exists. It's creating something new that's better for everyone. And I think, Kurt is an amazing athlete, but he's also an amazing leader and he has such a strong sense of social justice. So when you talk about diversity, you just can't isolate Kurt's athletic abilities. You've got to look at him as a whole human being.
So context is important. Essentially, that journalists need to be careful in their selection of words. Would that be good advice?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, Faith.
One question.
Yeah.
Hello. This is a question for all the panel. We've touched a lot on disability and how to report disability and how to address disability and be inclusive. But I guess my question for all of you is, what is missing? So what are the stories that are not being told that needs to be told? So we've got an opportunity to produce a whole body of work. So what are the stories that are not being told that these students can possibly look at addressing?
I think that because a lot of many disability stories in the media are framed around those 4 boxes that Alistair was talking about earlier on, there's quite a lot of stories that are missing in the community, and they revolve around people with disabilities volunteering, they revolve around people with disabilities achieving academically, they revolve around people with disabilities, raising families. As remarkable as it is to be a Paralympian and to have achieved in those areas, that kind of aspirational concept, I still think it's just as equally remarkable as for a person with a disability as anyone else to be achieving academically, to be achieving as a parent, as a role model in their society, as a volunteer. I think those stories, on a more broader level, need to be sort of foregrounded. And just to kind of tie up the autism debate, I think it's very what Pauline Hanson is kind of suggesting is the first sort of dangerous step toward segregating people who, for their benefit, the segregation is particularly dangerous because they're not being exposed to all elements of life and society if you segregate them. On the same token, I think as journalists, you're also missing out on, you would also be missing out on a huge opportunity to learn from all kinds of people. So if you begin by segregating, one element of society, or then that leads on to another, who makes those value judgments, and what are we denying society as a whole by doing that?
I would argue about looking at revisiting the Shutout report that was written in 2009 by the then National Disability Advisory Council of Australia. And what I'm talking about are vulnerable people who are shut out of society for a variety of reasons, where they're labelled as dangerous or as challenging behaviours, which justifies government, service providers, families and everyone to deny them their liberties and use a quote which is restrictive practices and shut them in jail, which are called specialised housing. And there are thousands of people with disabilities who are being exploited because of their vulnerability and made heaps of money out of it. In 2000, in my role as Director of QAI, in partnership with SUFI, and a journalist called Margaret Wenham, who also won a Walkley for her thorough journalism over 6 months, we exposed the abuse and neglect of vulnerable people living in boarding houses. We provided evidence of people being bought and sold and the corruption going on between bank managers, accountants and lawyers. And that evidence was given to then the police, and they were talking about resuming bodies. And of course, then government for the first time regulated the Residential Services Act in Queensland, which regulated hostels. But these people have gone to ground. There is much money to be made out of people. And just to give you an example, it still exists today in Hurston, a nursing home that no longer met the nursing home standards in 2000. They had 42 people living in that nursing home. People with, some were refugees, some were alcoholics, some were drug addicts, some were vulnerable people with intellectual disabilities and mental illness. No one was paid. They had a $600,000 interest-only loan. And to cut a long story short, those owners of that hostel were making $125,000 net profit per year out of 42 people taking their pensions. Now, this is a story that still is alive today. So if you really want to do some good investigative journalism, look at the way that vulnerable people with disabilities, the institutions, our legislation, our government agencies, our service providers, and I'm not labelling everyone, but there is corruption, and there is, whether it's corruption by design or corruption by default, but it's corruption through exploiting vulnerability and the denial of human rights. And when you're reporting, you have to report through the lens of a human rights framework, because after all, we're all human beings, we're all born equally, and we should be treated equally. And just look at the CRPD to use as a guide when you're doing your analysis in exposing the exploitation of vulnerable people with disabilities living in Queensland right here today, right now.
Brett, would you... Thank you, Kevin. Brett, would you like to wrap up this panel? What stories would you like to be seen reported?
Sure. I think sometimes what's missing in regards to stories is a little bit of understanding what you could be reporting on. And I'll give an example, and it's just quite a simple example. But you'll see a 38-year-old man charged with, a 38-year-old Mount Gravatt man charged with murder. And sometimes people with a disability, it's more about a 38-year-old deaf and dumb man charged with murder. So where is the ethical responsibility and behaviour in the journalism there? It's very far stretched. So where the reporting needs to be fair, needs to be understood, and needs to be investigative. Where it talks about a deaf and dumb person coming into the whole issue, if someone's being charged with murder, it's not because they were deaf that they were charged with murder, but you're sensationalising that deaf person has been charged with murder. So how could someone do that? So it's deviating from the angle as to what actually occurred in that situation or whatever the reason was. And I'm just using that as an example, not saying that all deaf people are murderers. Just wanted to put an example out there. So we've seen articles like that time to time when you're reading the newspaper. I can't access radio, so I can't comment about radio. But what we read, we just need to understand, is it fair? Are we being ethical in the way that we're reporting this? And it can be quite hit and miss from time to time, especially when we see the stories that we've seen so far.
Can I just say something? If it wasn't for my Hot Topics group, we would never have got this project off the ground, because we were the one that had Nan Paxton come and talk to us. And we were the ones that said to her, how about you go and do this sort of stuff? And if it hadn't have been for a few of the ladies from my Hot Topics group, Wild Women would never have got off the ground, or Community Living Project would have never got off the ground.
We'll be hearing from Leona from Wild in the next panel about the important work they do in domestic violence, but it's true.
It's been for people with a mild intellectual disability that have done a lot of things. If it hadn't have been for me jumping up and down, we would never have a person with a mild intellectual disability on their board of ASID. So,
It's good. The importance of listening, I think, can't be understated. So thanks for the questions, guys. They were really good questions. It's great you're listening. Thank you. Let's have a coffee and come back in 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Okay, that's a very quick coffee. Have a quick coffee and we'll be back with our next panel.